It was 1920. F. Scott Fitzgerald and his new bride Zelda spent their first summer together by the shores of Long Island Sound. Next door to their cottage lived a mystery millionaire who threw extravagant parties. At night, on a distant dock, a green light shimmered. And yet, the Fitzgeralds weren't on Long Island, the setting for one of America's most beloved novels. Scott and Zelda were across the Sound in Connecticut.
They told me they were making a documentary about the Fitzgeralds' time in Westport, Connecticut. And I thought, oh my God, hold on. And then they started talking to me about the subject of the documentary and what they were finding.
Went to visit Fitzgerald's at Westport. They had to burn his socks, sheets, everything. Stayed drunk for 2 weeks straight. Atmosphere of crime, lust, sensuality pervaded house.
This was this guy's estate.
Oh, this was Gatsby's.
Well, in their theory, right?
In their theory, this was Gatsby's estate.
Right. Nobody knew.
We certainly believe that Fitzgerald got the inspiration for The Great Gatsby while living in Great Neck.
They never considered Westport.
Berkeley's production on Fitzgerald is astounding.
I'm a little hesitant to say anything.
The scholar Matthew Buckley tried to correct everything that he saw as inconsistent external reality.
Buckley has a reputation as being a very domineering and bristly guy.
Matt, don't make a war about this.
He discovered a note to Fitzgerald which contained the famous identifying phrase, old sport.
How do you do, old sport? I'm Gatsby.
If you want to have a literary experience that makes your hair stand on end.
It all converges on Gatsby, and Gatsby is inexhaustible.
That's right.
Makes perfect sense.
In 1996, an article about Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald ran in the New Yorker. The piece suggested that their time in Westport, Connecticut, a short 5-month stint in 1920, provided the inspiration for The Great Gatsby. The Fitzgeralds lived next to a 175-acre estate, just as Nick Carraway's modest home was adjacent to the Gatsby mansion. The article's author, Barbara Probst Solomon, provided several other examples to support her thesis that the Westport period influenced Gatsby. And yet her ideas were dismissed by the scholarly community and ignored by the town of Westport. Barbara had grown up nearby on the opposite bank at the mouth of the Saugatuck River, a body of water leading to Long Island Sound.
When I was in my teens, I would sit at the edge of our dock. I knew that across the way was the Fitzgerald house, and I just casually began to wonder about it.
Richard Webb, a local historian, gave talks across the county about Fitzgerald's Westport period inspired by Barbara's article. After one such event for the Westport Historical Society, hosted by local author Robert Stephen Williams, the two discussed making this film.
This started as a love letter to the town.
Well, actually, for me, what it was is this town has changed dramatically over the last 20, 30 years. And what I found is that the people here are growing increasingly disconnected from the heritage that happened here. And so much great stuff has happened.
Westport is never dull.
Account men, writers, illustrators, TV guys, Westport had it all. This Gregory Peck film was about the struggle to balance career and family while commuting from Westport to the city. Perhaps the town's most famous couple was Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. They came to Westport to make a film in the late 50s and never left.
The I Love Lucy Show.
Lucy and Ricky spent an entire season here.
Fellow citizens of Westport, we are gathered here.
And Rod Serling, who lived here for many years before moving to Hollywood to do The Twilight Zone, used Westport to inspire A Stop at Willoughby. Many cherished authors spent time here, including J.D. Solinger, who put the final touches on this American classic while in Westport. And so Deej and Robert set out to make sure that the future generations of Westporters wouldn't forget that the Fitzgeralds lived here. The first thing they did was contact Barbara. She was an esteemed writer recognized by the King of Spain for her role in rescuing 2 Spanish students held in the Franco Gulag in 1948. She spent 5 years in Paris editing the resistance magazine Peninsula. She won countless awards and co-founded a literary magazine with her good friend Norman Mailer. During Deej and Robert's visit, they asked why her article hadn't turned the Fitzgerald world upside down. She said Matthew Broccoli, the world's preeminent Fitzgerald scholar, didn't believe Westport had anything to do with Gatsby.
He was certainly the preeminent Fitzgerald scholar of his generation.
Easily wrote the best biography by a long shot.
I think we really owe him a great deal. He was not happy when I wrote that piece. It upset all his theories.
I use his publications all the time. I think all of us do. The editions of letters, the facsimiles, the biography.
Had Barbara's love for her childhood home clouded her judgment? Or was there an academic conspiracy to deny Westport its rightful place in Fitzgerald's legacy?
To get Westport in the top 10 list of sites that people think of when they think of Fitzgerald is a noble cause, because right now it probably doesn't even make the top 25.
According to the experts, Fitzgerald drew from his 2 years in Great Neck to write Gatsby because his time there provided everything he needed for the novel.
I know that he moved to Westport after he sold his first novel. His first novel was published. I know he was only there for a few months, but that's never spoken of in Great Neck. We certainly believe that Fitzgerald got the inspiration for The Great Gatsby while living in Great Neck.
It was mostly based on his experiences, commuting from, his play, The Vegetable, was in Manhattan, and he was sort of going back and forth from the Great Neck LIRR station.
Everybody seems to believe that Great Neck is West Egg, and that Sands Point on the Port Washington Peninsula represents East Egg. There are places where you can certainly stand at what might have been Gatsby's location and see Daisy's Light. We do have a road called Gatsby Lane.
Real estate agents advertise many houses as the Gatsby House, and the Gatsby House is often sold.
He spent a lot of time partying with the likes of Ring Lardner, who was a writer.
If you talk about Great Neck, oh, yes, we know Fitzgerald is connected with Gregory, but they don't know anything about Westport.
There's that almost Candyland game board geography that you get with Great Neck and Sands Point, the Valley of Ashes, Corona, Queens, and then shoot along Northern Boulevard and you're in Manhattan. And the novel seems to play out in that constricted space, and it makes sense. Oh, it's got to be, Great Neck.
Gatsby is all conjecture.
Yeah.
And the evidence points certainly more to Long Island, since he set the book in Long Island. And the house that he lived in Great Neck is still there.
As far as Deej and Robert were concerned, Barbara's article deserved better.
It was such a magical time because when you look at their lives, it goes south very quickly for them. So this is like at the point where the rose is at its full bloom.
And so they decided to find out for themselves what really happened during those 5 months back in 1920 when the Fitzgeralds lived in Westport. It was an age of miracles. It was an age of art. It was an age of excess, and it was an age of satire.
We were just coming out of a war. The automobile was just catching on. The Russian Revolution had happened. Feminism was doing a bit of their dance. I don't know any other time where the climate has so changed so rapidly. He saw the impact of black jazz, up-and-coming Jews who were shaping the city, even unknowns to themselves. Art, money, was all getting entwined here. That intrigued him.
The formality of the Victorian age was giving way to a post-war optimism, representing an unprecedented shift in American society.
One of the first writers to catch on to he will be writing to a different world, about a different world, is Fitzgerald. He and Hemingway changed the language. Marvelous as Henry James is, this is not his world. This is not the world of Edith Wharton. Fitzgerald utterly understood this.
While the world was changing in dramatic fashion on so many fronts, so too was the small town of Westport, just 55 miles north of New York City on the coastal shores of Connecticut.
Westport was barely a town. It didn't have the structure that other places had. Westport didn't have enough of a police department to hinder prohibition. You didn't really have any law or order there. It could have been a piece of the West put down in the East.
Despite the frontier nature of the town, it was still home to farmers, artists, and some very wealthy individuals.
My dad first came here with James Earl Fraser, his teacher. Fraser was a wonderful sculptor. He was one of the foremost sculptors of the United States. He made the Buffalo Nickel, the End of the Trail, and many statues in Washington.
Fraser and the American modernist painter Arthur Dove were the first of the 20th century artists to make Westport their home. Many more would follow. Westport was also the home to several extremely wealthy individuals. Edward T. Bedford helped develop the petroleum byproduct Vaseline and went on to become a director of Standard Oil. A personal friend of John D. Rockefeller, Bedford became Westport's most generous benefactor. His name dons schools and other buildings throughout town, and the family's foundation continues to support local causes today. There was only one Westport resident who paid higher taxes than Bedford, Frederick E. Lewis. You won't find his name in any buildings here, nor a shred of his legacy at the Historical Society. He was the mystery millionaire who owned the 175-acre coastal estate adjacent to where the Fitzgeralds lived during their time in Westport.
Well, I wanted something on the other side of the channel, in Westegg.
Impossible. There isn't anybody can buy in there. That's the most exclusive stretch of property on Long Island Sound. But if you'll just take a look at this map, will you hold that in, please? Now, as you can see, you're directly across the channel from Westegg, here at East Egg. Here's you, and here's the Buchanan Showplace. It's right over there. At night, you can see the green light on their dock. It blinks.
This little shack behind you is rented by Mrs. Buchanan's second cousin. Another Yale College man named Nick Carraway. Stocks and bonds, but strictly small time.
This was this guy's estate.
Oh, this was Gatsby's.
Well, in their theory, right?
In their theory, this was Gatsby's estate.
Right. And he had his private beach back there, like in the book.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it was a 175-acre estate just right next door. What's interesting about being in the bedroom now is that, they'd been married just 4 weeks, and they'd been living in the hotel, the Biltmore, and they got kicked out of there, and then they end up here. So this is really their first place. And this is, as newlyweds. She was 19.
19.
Yeah. Fitzgerald writes an essay in 33, and in there he says an author has 2 or 3 great experiences in his life.
Oh, yeah, that, I was going to say, this must have been seminal,
Yeah, and so isn't Westport one of those 2 or 3 great experiences?
F. Scott Fitzgerald dropped out of Princeton and joined the Army in 1917. A commissioned second lieutenant, the Army led him to Montgomery, Alabama, where he met Zelda the following summer at the Country Club of Montgomery.
Zelda was just, I mean, she was sexually enlightened for her time period, absolutely. Zelda is also sort of helping herself get into this promiscuous state. But, you know, she started drinking gin at age 14, smoking cigarettes that same year. That leads to a Southern belle who's not quite as proper as her mother would like her to be. And she came from very proper families. You know, her father was the president of the Alabama Senate. He became the youngest associate Supreme Court justice. She had a grandfather who was a U.S. senator. He's pictured here, sort of like Andrew Jackson. Yeah, he does. He was a state senator from Kentucky and turned into a Confederate congressman. Her father was, you know, he passed the Voting Rights Act in Alabama that kept black people from voting.
A month after meeting Zelda, the novel that would become This Side of Paradise was rejected by Scribner's and Son. We hope we shall see it again. Encouraged, Fitzgerald rewrote it and resubmitted. But it was rejected again, this time shortly before his unit was sent to Long Island to prepare for sailing to France. But the Great War ended in November, and in February, Scott was discharged. Still intent on marrying Zelda, he took a job at a New York ad agency to prove he could support her.
The whole marriage was contingent on the book.
Yes.
This Side of Paradise was the deal maker.
Scott was obsessed with Zelda and sent her a constant stream of telegrams and letters from New York.
It's dreadfully hard to write so very much. I know you love me, darling, and I love you more than anything in the world, but if it's going to be so much longer, we just can't keep up this frantic writing.
But in June of 1919, she broke off the engagement. I was a failure. Mediocre at advertising work and unable to get started as a writer. Hating the city, I got roaring, weeping drunk on my last penny and went home. Back with his parents in St. Paul, he was determined to rewrite his book. He finished the manuscript and sent it to Scribner's yet again. I was an empty bucket, so mentally blunted by the summer's writing that I'd taken a job repairing car roofs in the Northern Pacific shops. Then, the postman rang. Dear Mr. Fitzgerald, I am very glad, personally, to be able to write to you that we are all for publishing your book.
I am very proud of you. I hate to say this, but I don't think I had much confidence in you at first. It's so nice to know you really can do things.
Over the next 6 months, Scott sold 15 short stories. On March 26, 1920, This Side of Paradise was published. The majority of the reviews were great. The glorious spirit of abounding youth glows throughout this fascinating tale. The first edition of the book sold out in 3 days. Think best to get married Saturday noon. First edition of the book is sold out. 3 days later, they were married. The Fitzgeralds were the talk of New York City. Dorothy Parker remarked,
They both look as though they just stepped out of the sun. Their youth was striking. Everyone wanted to meet them.
What happens when a 23-year-old gets instant fame and money?
Yeah.
They wind up like Britney Spears and Lindsay Lohan.
Yeah, no, we
on the
say
front
they're
cover
like
of the tabloids.
America's first rock stars.
They are. They're the first pop stars.
You know the scenes where they're doing the murder and there's pictures and there's strings and, you know, the connections? We took Zelda's only novel, Save Me the Waltz. We took Cruise of the Rolling Junk, first like motoring story. We took The Beautiful and Damned and we took The Great Gatsby. And we found phrases, words, and scenes that they're both talking about the same thing.
And then we matched that up with some of the correspondence or some of the essays, like My Lost City, and then the McKaig Diary. And that's where we started to see consistencies in the experience, or Deej and I tried to figure out how that related to what was really happening in Westport.
He and Zelda were drawing from the same sources, too. And that's why you get those correspondences between his writing and hers.
I remember riding in a taxi between very tall buildings under a mauve and rosy sky. I began to bawl because I had everything I wanted and knew I would never be so happy again. Scott was not the only artist in the family. Zelda painted, danced, and even wrote a novel. In Save Me the Waltz, about a young couple, David and his wife, Alabama, Zelda drew heavily on those early, joyful days of marriage.
As soon as David could make arrangements, he sent for her. The judge gave her the trip north for a wedding present. She quarreled with her mother about her wedding clothes. David and Alabama invited their friends to throw oranges into the drum at the plantation and themselves into the fountain at Union Square.
Another thinly veiled chronicle of those early years was described in Scott's second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, drafted in Westport. It was the story of Anthony and Gloria. It was, first of all, a time of discovery. Anthony found that he was living with a girl of tremendous nervous tension and of the most high-handed selfishness. Gloria knew within a month that her husband was an utter coward toward any one of a million phantasms created by his imagination.
Fitzgerald was a magpie. He picked up material everywhere, and he transformed it into fiction, both into his short fiction and into his novels, sometimes from the short stories on into the novels.
Anthony and Gloria returned from their honeymoon and grew restless in New York City. They heard the call of Connecticut. 4 weeks after the Fitzgeralds got married, they too moved to Connecticut.
Westport is the Forgotten Fitzgerald
Place.
location.
Yeah.
Do you think we're crazy?
They told me they were making a documentary about the Fitzgeralds' time in Westport, Connecticut. And I thought, oh my God, hold on. I'm sorry, guys, but I did. And what's next? Zelda's first shopping trip to Macy's in New York. I mean, how minute are we going to go? And then they started talking to me about the subject of the documentary and what they were finding. And they eventually showed me the rough cut that you're going to see. And it's fascinating. So I'm going to turn things over to them.
In acute agony and despair, we at last forcibly left the Commodore, bought a car, threw our bags in the back seat, and set out. "We're lost now," complained Anthony. "Read that sign. Marietta, 5 miles. What's Marietta? Never heard of it, but let's go on. We can't turn around here, and there's probably a detour back to the post road." The way became scarred with deepening ruts and insidious shoulders of stone. 3 farmhouses faced them momentarily, slid by. A town sprang up in the cluster of dull roofs around a white tall steeple. Arrived here at 9 o'clock this morning and immediately found the slickest little cottage on the Sound. Now we're in the most jovial mood imaginable.
Since we're sitting in the gray house, which is the actual house that Scott and Zelda lived in the summer of 1920, shortly after they were married, and so it was really their honeymoon cottage. It was only one summer, but in the novel, it takes place over a 2-year period. And so this house is a very significant setting within the novel Beautiful and Damned. They actually live here in the fictional world much longer than in the real world. And in the novel, it's referred to as the Gray House on several occasions. It was dark when the real estate agent of Marietta showed them the Gray House. They came upon it just west of the village, where it rested against a sky that was a warm blue cloak buttoned with tiny stars.
They signed a lease that night, and in the agent's car returned jubilantly to the somnolent and dilapidated Marietta Inn. For the first time since their return, she knew what she wanted.
Oh, yes, that's it. A little gray house with a sort of white around and a whole lot of swamp maples, just as brown and gold as an October picture in a gallery.
They ended up in Westport because Zelda was interested in a place where she could swim. People had told them that places up in New England had lakes that were far too cold for her to swim in. So that was the main reason why they ended up in Westport. It is there that she ran over a fire hydrant.
We have a house with a room for you and a ruined automobile because I drove it over a fire plug.
Then, Gloria, hesitating between two approaches and making her choice too late, drove over a fire hydrant and ripped the transmission violently from the car.
Westport was his and Zelda's first summer in the East. Think of all of us when we're around 20 and we see some other landscape. That has an effect that 10 years later, it wouldn't have. It's about growing up. Well, that had to be very powerful.
We have to remember that when he went to Westport, all of that was new. This was a new kind of living. These were new people. And he was seeing for the first time the great gaudy spree of the 1920s playing out in front of his eyes.
This postcard was written to her mom, and Zelda's writing to her mom, "Thanks for the sheets." Right, because she's just gotten married.
Yeah.
She's 19.
Yeah, it's like
she's in college.
You start out after they get married in Save Me the Waltz, they're in the scene where they're basically in the plaza in New York, right? And so they're in the bed together, and you sort of see this very claustrophobic space, and then they move. The next place they move is to Connecticut. The book moves to Connecticut, right? And so this is her chance to be the woman of the house, and yet she cannot fulfill that role.
You know, you just mentioned something that I never really thought about before. Her only novel, Save Me the Waltz. That was written 10 years later.
34, yep.
Yeah. And she's still thinking about this house.
Right.
Like Beautiful and Damned, he wrote a year after they lived here.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and it was very fresh. It's very fresh for her 10, 12 years later.
It's a long passage, but it's your grandmother writing about when they first get to Connecticut, and it's a beautiful passage.
I'm reading from Zelda's book, Save Me the Waltz, and this is her description of what we think might be Westport. The green hills of Connecticut preached a sedative sermon after the rocking of the gritty train. The gaunt, disciplined smells of New England lawn, the scent of invisible truck gardens behind the air in tight bouquets, apologetic trees sweep the porches, insects creaked in the baking meadows widowed of their crops. There didn't seem room in the cultivated landscape for the unexpected. I mean, all they'd done was get kicked out of hotels up until then, so it makes sense they would be trying to settle down in Connecticut.
Liquor came in on Campo Beach, a short walk from where Fitzgerald and Zelda lived that summer.
16 stills were reported in Westport. Truck carrying $17,000 worth of booze held up. Hawthorne N again seen of booze selling.
It is alleged that Rose was involved with a gang shooting at the Metropole.
What place is that?
The old Metropole. Filled with faces now dead and gone. Filled with friends, gone now forever. I can't forget as long as I live the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal there.
Bald Jack Rose was implicated in the conspiracy to kill Beansy Rosenthal. It was the most sensational event of the time in the criminal justice world.
He was a very simpatico, unsavory type, but perfect for a novel.
Outside the window, gray roads pulled the Connecticut horizon from before and behind to momentous crossing. A stone Minuteman kept the peace of the indolent fields.
More from their fear of solitude than from any desire to go through the fuss and bother of entertaining, they filled the house with guests every weekend and often on through the week. We've been having a gay time, drinking too damn much.
I don't think Zelda was painting yet, and I don't think, and Scott was probably working a good part of the day, and I don't think they had any breaks on their drinking. I think they were still learning to party.
It's been reported that Zelda loved to go skinny dipping at Hendricks Point, which was just beyond there, so she could have just walked out the back door.
They reveled in the orgies of Westport. Author on the rocks. Tried to take a country road and he lost the wheel. The party on its way to the Miramar Inn.
Fitzgerald in his ledger. I would suggest taking a look at his time period in Westport.
1920. Revelry and marriage. The rewards of the year before. The happiest year since I was 18.
1920 was the magic year in Fitzgerald's life. I don't think he was ever as happy again.
In 1919, I had made $800 by writing. In 1920, I had made $18,000.
I always felt a story in the Post was tops, a goal worth seeking. It really meant something, you know? They only took stories of real craftsmanship, but Scott couldn't stand to write them.
Westport was a formative experience for Fitzgerald. When he lived there, he was existing hand-to-mouth on short fiction that he wrote for the high-paying magazines. You have to remember that Fitzgerald did not inherit money. He didn't have a trust fund. He didn't marry money. He had to earn his money day by day by going to the work table, and he was quite disciplined about it. In his personal life, he was undisciplined and ragged. But in his professional life, he got down to business.
In Scott's essay, The Cruise of the Rolling Junk, written while in Westport, he was already worrying about money. We're living above our income, and all we've got to show for it is a farmer's car and a few clothes. Don't let the victor belong to the spoils. You mean write trash, Richard considered? But the really awful days aren't when I think I can't write. They're when I wonder whether any writing is worthwhile at all. I mean, whether I'm not a sort of glorified buffoon.
But he published some of his best stories while he was in Westport. Mayday, The Cut Glass Bowl, Bernice Bobs Her Hair, and The Ice Palace, which is one of my favorites.
It was a time where Scott had the confidence of having been a success as a writer, and Zelda hadn't found her voice yet, although she wasn't unhappy. I don't think that Scott was borrowing her diaries for writing Beautiful and Damned.
I recognized a portion of an old diary of mine which mysteriously disappeared shortly after my marriage, and also scraps of letters which, though considerably edited, sounds to me vaguely familiar. In fact, Mr. Fitzgerald, I believe that is how he spells his name, seems to believe that plagiarism begins at home.
Zelda had always fascinated Fitzgerald. He was enamored of her very much, but also he saw her as wonderful material for his fiction. When those diaries came into his hands, he must have seen them both as a document that gave him insight to his wife, but also he must have seen their commercial possibilities.
George G. Nathan, Scott's editor at the literary magazine Smart Set, found Zelda's diaries in the basement of the Westport home. They interested me so greatly that in my capacity as a magazine editor, I later made her an offer for them. When I informed her husband, he said that he could not permit me to publish them since he had gained a lot of inspiration from them and wanted to use parts of them in his own novels and short stories. I am very sorry to hear that your husband is neglectful of his duties to you in the way of chewing gum. That is the way husbands get after 5 months of marriage.
Zelda knew how to tantalize men. She was very good at it. And most of them understood not to take it too seriously. But apparently George Jean Nathan did, and he had a serious thing for Zelda. So much so that Scott had to have a little talk with him.
Many years after leaving Westport, Zelda painted a lampshade featuring some of the places they'd lived, including the Gray House in Westport.
Zelda put Nathan on that lampshade, maybe as an act of rebellion against Scott, because he did try to manage her. She was pretty unmanageable, though. I don't think he had much success.
One more thing we found interesting is the Great Neck House isn't on that lampshade where they spent the most amount of time, but Westport is.
In May of 2015, the Fitzgerald Great Neck home went on the market. It garnered worldwide coverage in such media outlets as the BBC, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. That same month, the Fitzgerald Westport home finally sold. It barely generated local press, let alone international coverage. The Fitzgeralds spent a lot of time with Scott's Princeton friends, including Alexander McKaig, who also kept a diary.
The McKaig diaries are particularly valuable because though he was friendly with the Fitzgeralds, he also was somewhat disapproving.
We're only the second people to contact you about this diary?
Yes, that's correct. The other person was from either North or South Carolina.
Great.
And it was several years ago.
McKaig's diary has been quoted by biographers, but it seems to be the same things quoted over and over. That's why we wanted to see it.
Well, the reason the biographers are all quoting the same source is that they're quoting each other.
We've read McKaig's diaries from start to finish and came up with some pretty startling revelations.
Look at that, he comes back from the party, came back that night, very ill, exclamation point.
Just 9 days after Scott's wedding, McKaig wrote, "Called on Scott Fitz and his bride. Latter temperament, small town, Southern belle. Chews gum, shows knees. I do not think marriage can succeed. Both drinking heavily. Think they'll be divorced in 3 years. Scott will write something big, then die in a garret at 32.
Many people envied the Fitzgeralds, and many of Fitzgerald's Princeton friends who did not take him seriously when he was an undergraduate there were astonished that he could become the kind of writer that he did. People fell in love not with Zelda and not with him, but with the two of them together.
By the 4th of July, their partying had become as time-consuming in Westport as it had been in New York. Firemen made quick run to Minuteman but found no fire. Operator says alarm came from Fitzgerald's. They deny it. Some member of the family suggested that possibly someone came into the house during their absence and sent in an alarm. Fitzgerald's, from whose telephone central says the alarm came, deny it. Say they were out of the house, but will pay costs. Legend has it, when the fire chief asked Zelda where the fire was, she pointed to her breast.
Did you ever read this short story, The Cruise of the Rolling Jump?
No. It's like the first road story.
We began to sing a song about biscuits. The song related how down in Alabama all the good people ate biscuits for breakfast, which made them very beautiful and pleasant and happy, while up in Connecticut all the people ate bacon and eggs and toast, which made them very cross and bored and miserable, especially if they happened to have been brought up on biscuits.
When I was researching a book I wrote about my mother, I went to Montgomery, Alabama, and met one of Zelda's old childhood friends, Catherine Haxton, and they had danced together, they were belles together. One time, Catherine remembered, soon after Scott and Zelda were married, they drove to Montgomery unannounced. Judge and Mrs. Sayer had gone to New York, and the two couples missed each other, so Catherine got the benefit of the visit. One morning, Zelda was looking for a toothbrush. She called, "Scott, what'd you do with the toothbrush?" Didn't have but one. I thought that was the sweetest, most romantic thing I'd ever heard of.
The joys of motoring are more or less fictional, and, too, we had to leave the car in Alabama.
You are a rotten driver.
We missed it, didn't we?
In the case of The Cruise of the Rolling Junk and The Beautiful and Damned, a lot of it had to do with automobiles and driving, which was a novel sort of thing. You read The Cruise of the Rolling Junk and you see that car travel was hazardous and dangerous and a great adventure. All of that comes to fruition in The Great Gatsby with Gatsby's gorgeous yellow car. It all does come in a sequence, and it helps you track Fitzgerald's thinking and the development of his thought.
I think, as some people have said, Gatsby was his second try at it. The Beautiful and the Damned was the first.
It worked in The Beautiful and Damned, so he's going to draw from it and put pieces of it in Gatsby, too. Makes perfect sense.
Who was Jay Gatsby modeled on?
I find it interesting that so many people are digging into who were the sources for Gatsby. There have been some specific names proposed, and then there have been other theories, so we may never know.
I heard he was in oil from a man who knew all about him, grew up with him in Texas.
I knew somebody who grew up with him in St. Paul.
Well, you look at him sometimes when he doesn't know anyone's looking at him. You can see it in his eyes. I bet he did kill a man.
Which one is he?
Yes, there is something ultimately about Gatsby that we never quite know.
You're not supposed to be able to grasp it.
Right,
Yeah.
his essence, yeah.
But I don't think there's any one person who served as a model for Gatsby.
He took his experience, of course, as you're saying, it all comes from your own experience, but he blends different times of his life, different people he knew, with himself, and creates composites. In fact, Hemingway wrote him a famous letter criticizing him for that. You should base one character on one person, like I do. Like
Really?
Hemingway does, yeah.
You could have the ambition and the pretense that you would be able to see so thoroughly into another person's character that no part of you would show up in the description.
And
I'm not sure I believe
No,
that.
I don't either. And I think Fitzgerald wrote him back and rejected.
It all converges on Gatsby, and Gatsby is inexhaustible.
All those people who claim to have a piece of Scott's original raw material in their community, they might have a partial truth.
Everyone's colored by their own prejudice of where they grew up. So when we interview people from Long Island, they're all convinced Gatsby's from Long Island.
The danger of writing a book about Gatsby is that you then hear from all these people all over the world who've got the key.
We're not supposed to read Gatsby and think Westport. That wasn't Fitzgerald's intention. He wanted us to read Gatsby and think Long Island. But since he didn't have those experiences on Long Island, since they came out of his magic year of 1920 on Westport, where he had a beach, he had a cottage next to a mysterious recluse, that's what he's using as his model.
I think the interesting thing about all of these speculations and surmises and everything is that it's great if it enlivens the book. It's awful if it weighs it down.
My father was on the scene when we started to lose our way during Gatsby's time, and he recorded it all. The generosity, the greed, the innocence, and the cynicism, the magnificence and the waste that was America between the two world wars. People read him now for clues and guidelines, as if by understanding him and his Beautiful and Damned period, they could see more clearly what's wrong.
The thing that jumps out for me is she also puts in, and his beautiful and damp period, which is...
I can see that puts it right in your movie.
Yeah.
I would say that scenically, Great Westport was very, very important. That people think that the scenes were really, you know, of the water and Gatsby's home and all that was really Kings Point. It was really more of the Connecticut view, and most people don't realize that.
Again, the obvious that I missed for decades reading the book, you can look out across the water and see a dock and a green light. You can in Westport. He didn't have that experience in Long Island.
No, I agree with all of that. It's really remarkable how Fitzgerald could carry those experiences and those images in his mind for years and years, and then call them up from the port of memory and set them down.
In the novel, Nick lives in a little cottage next door to a big estate that goes down to Long Island Sound. It's one thing that makes you think that the Westport experience, brief as it was, made a lasting impression on Fitzgerald when he was conceiving this book. I had never thought of that before. But it's certainly next door, the way Carraway's cottage is next door to Gatsby's mansion, to this estate, and a mansion right next to where we're sitting just now.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that even if he was thinking of setting the book in North Shore of Long Island, it's the next door-itness of it, as you pointed out, that may have stuck in his mind, and he added that detail to the book.
Maybe it didn't do anything more than just give him permission.
To move things around.
To say to himself, there could be a grand house, and there could be a little dinky little house right beside of it. I know this because I lived in one.
That's right.
My new novel, called The Flight of the Rocket, concerns the life of one Anthony Patch between his 25th and 33rd years. He's one of those many with the tastes and weaknesses of an artist, but with no actual creative inspiration. How he and his beautiful young wife are wrecked on the shoals of dissipation is told in the story. I hope it'll be in your hands by November 1st.
There's this key scene in Beautiful and Damned where Gloria runs out of the house and goes to the train station after a big party. They're drunk. Anthony stumbles after her, and they end up on a train and in New York. And that exact scene is almost paralleled in the Alexander McKaig diary for September 15th.
Zelda, drunk. Having decided to leave Fitz and having nearly been killed walking down railroad track, blew in. Fitz came shortly after. He'd caught the same train with no money or ticket. They threatened to put him off, but finally let him stay on. Zelda refusing to give him any money. They continued their fight while here.
She'd gone some distance along the barely discernible road, probably half a mile, past the single deserted barn that loomed up, black and foreboding, the only building of any sort between the gray house and Marietta. Then she turned the fork where the road entered the wood. That was the great cascade of wires that rose high over the river like the legs of a gigantic spider whose eye was a little green light in a switch house and ran with the railroad bridge in the direction of the station.
Interesting that that was based on real experience. I always sensed that it probably was. Now we have the proof.
On that day, they left the gray house, which had seen the flower of their love. That's a pretty good line, isn't it? And if that's autobiographically true, which I see no reason to think it isn't, Zelda certainly, and Scott too, felt that this is where their relationship was at its most passionate.
Went to visit Fitzgerald's at Westport. They had to burn his socks, sheets, everything. Stayed drunk for 2 weeks straight. Atmosphere of crime, lust, sensuality pervaded house.
I don't know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
I had never heard of F.E. Lewis.
No, there's F.E. Lewis.
Okay.
Never heard of F.E. Lewis.
Fitzgerald was in the little cottage with Zelda. Next to them on the left was that fantastic millionaire or today be a billionaire. The fact that Lewis had these parties that really resemble a Antonioni movie.
Society sure to fly high at Saugatuck Fete on Saturday. Arrow to club to carry passengers skyward. Lewis's parties attracted the country's top celebrities, including Fitzgerald's favorite movie star, Ina Claire. John Philip Sousa wrote and performed a song for a Lewis event. Houdini bound and pushed off dock in mystery stunt.
Houdini would come popping up, and he did.
Marceline the Clown. Whole animal circus shipped out of New York.
Photographs of the parties next door to the little cottage that Scott and Zelda lived in. They looked like stills from an early version of The Great Gatsby.
And there was no end to it.
Those parties must have been something, I'll tell you.
If he saw Lewis's house, and as you say, Lewis's house had a ramshackle aspect to it, maybe that aspect goes into Gatsby's mansion. Not the Norman architecture, not the turrets, but the fact that it was sort of ramshackle.
And I can't imagine that he was ever a free-wheeling, drinking carouser, but perhaps he was. He had, after all, 4 wives at the end of the line. But do you sort of get the kind of man that he was? He was sort of almost like a Howard Hughes.
Well, you gotta believe Fitzgerald must have met this man, but there's no reference in any of his letters.
Although other Lewis parties didn't garner the attention of that event with Sousa and Houdini, Lewis's extravagance had no limit. Several times he'd brought real cowboys and Indians to his Westport estate for Wild West battle reenactments. And of course, Lewis hosted soirees that summer of 1920 for the town's well-to-do.
When I first came to Westport, I rented a home at 95 South Campo Road from Maggie Jelliff Schuyler, and she and Zelda were exactly the same age. And during that summer, she attended parties at 3 homes, the Stranahans, the Lewises, and at the Bedfords. And it was at the Lewises' home that she was introduced to Zelda. Zelda's actions at the party, Zelda got very drunk. She was quite an exhibitionist. There was dancing at the party, but apparently she went beyond the conventions of the time period and was not asked back, although he did allow her apparently to use his beach.
I didn't know about his experience living next door to this reclusive millionaire in Westport. That is very, very valid material for his own personal experience as a writer, bringing that to bear on his new novel. Setting Gatsby's mansion and Nick Carraway's cottage in a fictional place named West Egg isn't, if only subconsciously, an echo of Westport. Westport, West Egg.
I agree. All of that about the mansion next door was a great revelation to me. I had never seen that anywhere. I did not know that that mansion existed. I'm certain that Fitzgerald patterned The Great Gatsby with Nick's little bungalow next to Gatsby's great mansion next door. I'm certain that came from the experience that you're describing. It's rare to find anything new in Fitzgerald's scholarship. Truly it is. Most of it is very familiar and very repetitive. Well, this is truly fresh.
You have to acknowledge that he's, one of the 2 or 3 biggest names in Fitzgerald scholarship.
I'm a little hesitant to say anything because I did not know him that well personally. I worked for him.
Berkeley's production on Fitzgerald is astounding.
He was always very gracious and kind to me. He was just a larger-than-life figure.
He was the person who discovered that there is material evidence that a man named Gerlach had inspired The Great Gatsby. He discovered a note from Gerlach to Fitzgerald, which contained the famous identifying phrase, "Old Sport."
How do you do, old sport? I'm Gatsby.
For people who really want to nail down who was Gatsby modeled on, that postcard is kind of like the holy grail. Oh, there's the There's the phrase that we associate with Gatsby.
Very often, people get excited about the facts and forget the artwork.
I know that the scholar Matthew Bruckley tried to correct everything that he saw as inconsistent external reality, but there got to be something of a disagreement over correcting those things, because it is a work of art.
He was so abusive to Eleanor Lanahan, Bobbie as I knew her. He said, I'm not going to have some dumb broad tell me what should be in Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. My father had had a very different relationship with him because he'd been very abusive about our editions. He said they were all corrupt. My father didn't have much use for him, and my father thought it was very unhealthy the way he totally dominated Scotty.
F. Scott described one stop in Gatsby as Astoria when it really technically would have been Long Island City. Those kind of things don't matter. You don't go around correcting Van Gogh's irises and make them straighter.
Because he was such an impossible speller, I think the editors assumed these things that didn't add up, the streets, the this, the that, was just more of Fitzgerald's sloppiness. It wasn't.
I begged him when he was fighting with the other trustees and Fitzgerald's granddaughter about word changes in the official edition of Gatsby.
He attempted to dominate the field, and he did. But I have to be careful. You know, he directed my dissertation. I knew him well in his early years.
If things don't exactly all marry up, I mean, first of all, who cares? It's fiction.
My editor, who I think may have published one of his books, said, you know, Barbara, he's very unhappy because this is contrary to all his theories.
Benito Bruckley, he was Il Duce when it comes to Fitzgerald scholarship.
I don't think academics are organized enough. There was never an active campaign against that article or against Barbara.
Oh, he absolutely would have tried to squelch it. If it wasn't his idea and he didn't believe in it, it was heresy. It shouldn't be printed.
If anything wasn't in his biography, my guess is that he wanted to undermine it.
As I've had major hassles, he's sued us. It's been really, really unpleasant over such issues.
Right.
And of whether he should be allowed to change the book or not.
Professor Broccoli sought to change various words in The Great Gatsby to correspond to what he believed the author must have meant.
Matt, don't make a war about this. But it became so personal. He did, and it was the end of his life's dream. He had been the Fitzgerald editor of the official annotated Cambridge Fitzgerald, and he turned it over.
I feel like I knew guys like him. These professors, these scholars who had lived for decades, you know, with, in this case, Fitzgerald or whoever, you know, whoever their great white whale was. They knew everything that they thought there was to know about the author's life. I almost feel like I wish this end phase of Bruckley's involvement with Fitzgerald, and especially The Great Gatsby, I wish that could be forgotten.
In Scott's fourth novel, Tender as the Night, his character Dick Diver published a book in 1920 while living in Connecticut. Scott wrote, "Most of us have a favorite, a heroic period in our lives, and that was Dick Diver's."
In My Lost City, where he's saying he knew back then in 1920 he would never be as happy as again. And in Tender as the Night in 33, he's saying that's the heroic moment for Dick Diver. Is he saying that about himself?
Well, certainly. Everyone has an heroic moment. The difference is that artists like Fitzgerald remember those moments and can transform them into art. In 1939, Fitzgerald was trying to be a surrogate parent through the mail. He was an epistolary father. He didn't see Scotty very much, and he wanted to assure her, though he and Zelda were no longer together, that they loved her and that what she read in his fiction was not indeed a transcription of what had happened.
I wish The Beautiful and Damned had been a maturely written book because it was all true. We ruined ourselves. I have never honestly thought that we ruined each other. We had a much better time than Anthony and Gloria had.
Anthony Patch is not F. Scott Fitzgerald. Anthony Patch is a failure. He pretends to be a writer, and he sharpens his pencil, and he clears his throat, and he puts tablets of paper down on his desk, and then he wanders off without setting down a word. But that was not Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald came to the work table regularly, and he got his writing done. Likewise, Zelda was a much more complicated young woman than Gloria. Gloria is beauty personified. She's surface. She is alluring, but finally doesn't have much depth. Zelda did.
Westport got the best year of his life, or vice versa.
Amazing, because, you know, they lived for 2 years in this house in Great Neck, but he never wrote about that house.
There was always a lot of problem as to why it didn't work with Long Island. I say because half of his mind was in Westport.
Fitzgerald wrote 3 chapters of The Great Gatsby before he left for France. And it was really not until he could get away from all of the allurements of the city.
Yeah, and when he describes the largest domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound, I think he was drawing upon his first experience of the Long Island Sound when he actually had time to experience it and the great parties next door.
The evidence for Beautiful and Damned is all here. Why isn't that satisfying enough? You know, that you've got the setting for this wonderful second novel.
The right next doorness, right? It's pretty appealing.
Do you know where they
right? Because that's true in the novel and it's true here.
True. And the only two
that's a good point.
Where they live.
You live right next door.
Yeah, and I think you guys are missing a trick, because when you were talking about the beautiful and the damned, and you were talking about it too, and you were talking about the fact that you can walk to the train station.
Follow the walk of the book.
Yeah. If you want to have a literary experience that makes your hair stand on end, take the walk. And the same opportunity is here, with or without absolute proof.
Exactly.
The same opportunity is here.
Yeah.
The house is right next door.
Yeah, take the walk.
Take the walk. Walk across the lawn to the party.
Now,
I think that's the... If there's a thrill in this, that's the thrill.
Nick Carraway, it's a pleasure. You live in the cottage across the lawn.
The other thing, if you're making arguments in your own favor here, that it sounds like this was the moment of the most intense love that those two experienced, and it seems to me that that's the core of it, isn't it? That is just the hopeful, idealistic
the green light
dream of real, enduring love.
Yeah, I think,
and with the strong implication that you don't get that in this world. So if that's what he went away from here feeling, well, then you know, then maybe this place did animate that novel.
I think it was one of those peak creative times in their lives when he hadn't yet written Gatsby, and they were independent for the first time, so there was an exuberance and an energy. So it was an important time in their lives.
His experience in Westport was something that he didn't have in Long Island. The house Fitzgerald lived in when he wrote the first draft of The Great Gatsby in Great Neck had nothing to do with Nick Carraway's cottage.
Right,
nothing. Zero. Didn't even look out over the water, and it was hardly a little cottage on the edge of a millionaire's estate.
So we don't have a clue if there really was a Gatsby mansion or where it existed.
Alice, are you aware of a Long Island contingent that is at war with our friends here?
Just say Long Island concedes.
That's his story. That's his story.
we're very fortunate to have the woman here who really started us on this journey, Barbara Probst Solomon, and please give her a big hand. An incredible writer, incredible woman from Westport. She's one of our own.
Thank you. Thank all of you for coming.
Westport deserves its history. And you got it.
So I was rewatching, and I'm not saying this because you're here, but The Best Gatsby, 74. You know what was great that you guys...
I was in that one.
I minor role.
I learned that they were my grandparents when I was about 11, and Life magazine came to our house and filmed the children posing with some of the mementos in our attic. And then that got a lot of publicity, especially in school. I was embarrassed by my grandparents because I didn't know a lot about them, and other people seemed to know more, and I felt that an extravagant amount was expected of me all of a sudden. I really should be totally grateful, and I am. I celebrate them.
Scott writes something big, then die in a garret at 32. Okay?
Then I wandered down to the beach and sprawled out on the sand. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes. A fresh, green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face, for the last time in history, with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. And as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow, we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.
I have simply put out of my mind all their troubles and sorrows and think of them only as they must have been when they were young. I do think that in the years when they were happy, they had a more intense enjoyment and experience than the majority of people can hope to have in all their lives, so that in a sense, the quality of their 2 lives atones for their brevity.
What do you think about that passage?
I think it's very sensible. My mother was very sensible. That was a survival tactic, way more sensible than either of her parents. It was a very good way to look at it, to know that they had a flash of creativity and that enough was wrapped up in that to make for more than the equivalent of a good, long, average life.